I want to discuss disjunctive syllogisms. And the disjunctive syllogism is an either-or statement. Sometimes it may just have the or between two options, x or y options. Now, the statement that gives you both options, or more, you might have more than two options, it's called the major premise, and the one who eliminates or affirms options, and it follows the major premise, it's called the minor premise. Now, either x or y, the one thing you need to remember with a major premise, disjunctive premise, is that one of the options has to obtain, alright? So you have to affirm one of the options. So if you say not y, you take away this option, you're left with x. So x has to be the conclusion. And then, that would be valid. Now remember, we don't know whether it's true or not. Truth at this point depends on whether the actual individual proposition correlates to reality. So if it were either there are unicorns or there are Bigfoot beasts or whatever, well, there are no unicorns. Okay, therefore there must be Bigfoot. Well, we don't even know if that's true or not, but logically that option would have to obtain. Alright. Now here's another one. Either x or y, no x. So I'm doing the same thing as above, right? It doesn't matter what option you take away. If you take away options from the major premise, what is left, whether it's only one option or more, is got to be your conclusion. So here we go, therefore y. Here's a problem, either x or y, and if someone were to say, okay, y, and then the answer would be, okay, therefore not x, this would be wrong, okay? Now I changed it because that was just my typo. I should have been more careful as I was preparing this, but I meant to have written therefore not x. Either x or y, if I affirm an option, that doesn't mean that the other option must be negated. Because the promise of a major premise like this, when it's a phrase like this, an either or statement, and that's it, it's called inclusive, an inclusive framing. It's not telling you that both can be the case. So maybe it's both x and y. It's just the promise is that at least one of these has to obtain, but that doesn't mean the other doesn't obtain either. Maybe the other one also obtains. So this cannot be drawn. This is invalid. Okay, let's take another look. I'm going to put content in now. Either the wall is wet, see here's an option, or the floor is wet, so here's another option. Now if I go the wall is wet, you cannot say then that the floor is not wet. Because can't both be wet at the same time? Is there anything in a natural or unintentional setting where, I mean, can't you imagine both the wall and the floor being wet at the same time? So if you affirm one option, that doesn't automatically mean that the other option must be negated. If it is in a major premise, that's just either or. Okay? So this is not correct. You can't draw this conclusion. Well, what about something like this? Either the wall is wet or the floor is wet. The wall is not wet. So what I'm doing is I'm taking away this option, see? Well, then I'm left with the floor is wet, and that's my conclusion, okay? Because at least one of those options has to obtain. Now, this is a different framing. This is called an exclusive framing. Now, let me go up here, okay? Either the wall is wet or the floor is wet. You see how it's framed? It's just either or, right? And you have the two options. Well, down here, I have either or, and then I have this very important phrase, but not both. Okay, now that makes it exclusive, and that means that one option obtains, and then automatically the other one does not obtain. So if I say the wall is wet, you can automatically say, well, the floor is not wet. Okay, now you can still imagine a situation where the wall and the floor can both be wet, right? But that situation is eliminated by the framing of this major premise. The major premise sets up the context of the syllogism. And now, because it says not, but not both, we really cannot let a situation in which both the floor wall are wet, obtain, because it says but not both up here. So you see the logic is good. If you don't like this limitation, your objection is not with the logic, the way things flow here. Your objection is how the major premise is set up, and then you have to take that objection to whoever set up the major premise. Let's go to another one here. Sometimes things get a little tricky. Either the wall is wet or the wall is dry. Well, you see, wet means not dry, right? So this is basically saying either the wall is not dry or the wall is dry. The wall is not dry. Oh, excuse me. This has to be wall. Right? Because wet means not dry. So this is redundant. You see how these are redundant? And if you realize that the two options that are given to you, the wall is wet or the wall is dry, have the same subject. Here's the wall and wall. And what is predicated about that subject are really definition and anti-definition, if you will, or the opposite. Then you really have an exclusive major premise. They can't both be the case, right? So I'm going to stop here. This is part A. We'll come back to part B in a second.